Hi, hello, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be tier ranking all of the books that I read last year for 2023. Today is January 4th, and it still feels very weird to refer to 2023 as last year because it was literally a few days ago. But today, like I said, we are going to be tier ranking all of the books that I read last year, which was 108 books. My goal originally was 50 books, but then I think halfway through the year I hit 50, so I changed it to 100, and we read 108. So I'm very excited. I did already set my 2024 goal on Goodreads. I set it to 115, so just a few more than what we read in 2023. So we'll see how that goes. But before we get into anything 2024, I really want to kind of wrap up 2023. I sat down yesterday and binged a ton of these videos, and they were so entertaining, so I thought it'd be really fun to do it myself as well. So I do have 6 different categories that we're going to be placing the books into. And the first category we have is Can't Stop Thinking About It, and it's quite literally books that I cannot stop thinking about. These are most likely going to be 5-star reads, but not only that, they're also ones that just made me feel things. Whether I cried, I laughed, just got so giddy. They just had a little something extra over all of the rest of the books, even other 5-star books. Second category is thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend, books that I really loved and I would 100% recommend to you. Category number 3 is She Was Okay. These ones are going to be more of our kind of like 3-star territory. They're very middle ground. I enjoyed them, but I might not recommend them. But if I do recommend them, they're most likely going to come with some sort of like disclaimer. And then the fourth category I actually stole from a fellow booktuber. Her name is Chocolate Eclair. She recently came out with a tier ranking video, and this was one of her categories, and I absolutely loved it. You've Been Demoted, which is basically books that I originally ranked higher, but I have since decided they weren't as good as I remember. I'm very much like a feelings type of rater, and sometimes, you know, feelings fade. And then our second to last category is I Read It, which are essentially books that I read. I didn't necessarily enjoy the book, but we got through it. And then our very last category is simply not for me. Books that I just didn't really enjoy. They might have actually been good. Actually, there's one specifically that I can think of that I didn't mind. It was a cute book, but it just is not something that I'm going to continue reading. Like, it's just not for me. And obviously I'll go into more detail as we go through the books, but that's our little brief over of our categories. Now let's start tier ranking our giant pile of books. I'm literally so excited. I think this is gonna be so fun. Also, we are gonna be going through every single book in order from like the first one to the last one that I read throughout the year, except when it comes to a series. Those ones I kind of clumped together just to make things easy for myself. But other than that, these are all in order as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. I feel like this has been the longest intro on the planet of Earth. And the very first book that we have is gonna be maybe a little controversial. This is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. And we're going to be putting that one straight into You've Been Demoted. I read Book Lovers and Beach Read kind of like back to back. I read Beach Read at the very end of 2022, and then Book Lovers again was like the very first one that I read in 2023. I gave both of those initially 4 stars after I finished reading them, but honestly, I can hardly remember what either of those books are about, and I can't remember the difference between the two. So I can't give it a 4-star review. People We Meet on Vacation, which we'll get into in a little bit. Actually, let's just put that one up there because we're talking about it. That one I think I read in February, and that one so far is by far my favorite Emily Henry book that I've read. And I did give that one 4 stars. So I'm gonna say thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. The second book that I read is Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen, and we're gonna put that one in She Was Okay. Are we gonna do that actually? No, we're gonna change it to I Read It. It's probably gonna be at like the top of the I Read It category because I don't think it was a bad book by any means, but it just wasn't for me. I'm kind of realizing that magical realism is not my genre. I either want it to have magic or not. But then also too, I feel like the last like half of the book was kind of more depressing. All the characters had some sort of like past trauma and things like that, and I don't like reading about sad things. Next up we have Lunar Love, and that one is also going into I Read It. I didn't really like this one, which is so weird. I feel like I should have. This is basically a romance between 2 matchmakers. One of them has like an online matchmaker and the other one is like an in-person matchmaker, but they both use the Chinese zodiac as a way to match people, and the concept of that is so fun. I'm a big believer in astrology, but I don't know. The writing wasn't my favorite. I feel like the story was longer than it needed to be. I don't really remember much about it except for the things that I didn't really like about it, so we're putting it in I read it. Next up we have the Inheritance games, which I basically binged the entire trilogy within a few days, and I do just have the first book as kind of like a representation of the series as a whole, because even though I do think I liked the second book like a little bit more than the other two, it was just marginally, and just overall I have kind of like the same thoughts about the series as a whole. And that one is definitely going to be going into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. It got a little weird at the end, it got a little crazy, but overall really enjoyed it. Next up we have What Alice Forgot, and we're going to put that one in She Was Okay, because she was okay. I enjoyed it, but it's definitely not a book that would like pop in my head if someone asked for a recommendation. Next up we have A Touch of Darkness, and this is going straight to the top in Can't Stop Thinking About It, because I absolutely loved this series and I cannot wait to finish it off this year. And I talked about it so many times on this channel, so I'm not going to go like into detail, but it's basically a Hades and Persephone retelling, and it is a spicy romance. It was my first ever spicy romance, so it just has a special place in my heart. Next up we have The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and we're going to put that one in either She Was Okay or You've Been Demoted. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in You've Been Demoted, simply for the fact that it is technically probably like a She Was Okay book. Like, it's very middle ground for me. I enjoyed it, but it's one of those books that I really have not thought about for a second since I stopped reading it. And I think I did originally give it 4 stars. So I feel like it fits into the You've Been Demoted. Next up we have Desperate Measures, which is the first book in the Wicked Villains series, which is basically a smut series. And we're gonna go ahead and put this first book in I Read It. I do actually have 3 different books of that series to kind of demonstrate my thought process going through reading that entire series. I would definitely consider the Wicked Villains series more of erotica, not even smut, and I was not prepared. This series is kind of like an interconnected standalone where the stories kind of intertwine with each other a little bit, like the characters kind of pop in other books, and it's all within the same universe, but each book focuses on a specific couple. So you don't necessarily have to read them in order, but I probably would. That being said, Learn My Lesson was definitely my favorite of the entire series, and that one is technically the second book, but I don't think I read it until like second to last, which that one is about Hades, and essentially every single book in this series takes place at his adult club. And it was really interesting, and I think that's why I liked this one the best out of all of them, is it kind of like tied in everyone else's story. So I'm actually kind of glad that I read that one near the end. I hesitate to put it in Thoroughly Enjoy, would recommend, just for the fact that, again, it is kind of like an erotica series and it's not going to be for everyone. So I definitely would not recommend that to everyone. But I'm definitely going to put the rest of the series in She Was Okay, which is going to be represented by the third book in the series, which is A Worthy Opponent, and that is a kind of like hooked Peter Pan retelling. Not retelling, but like inspired by, which, by the way, the other big kind of like appeal to this series for me was the fact that they're not retellings, but they are inspired by Disney movies, so it was a lot of fun. Next up we have Neon Gods by Katie Robert, who is also the author of the Wicked Villain series that we just talked about. And this one I think I read right after the first book that I read from the Wicked Villains, so I was very hesitant, but I had heard somewhere that it was a little less intense. So I went ahead and gave that one a shot, and it definitely is a little tamer, like ever so slightly, but it is a thicker book. The Wicked Villain series books are very, very thin, so you don't have a whole lot of time to like build a really good plot, whereas the Neon Gods is definitely like a normal sized book, so you get a little bit more plot, which definitely made the story a little bit more enjoyable. That being said, I have not continued the series, and I don't honestly know if I'm going to. She was just okay. Next up we have The Love Hypothesis, and this is going into Can't Stop Thinking About It. This is one of my top romances of the year. I read it in February for a like Valentine's Day like reading vlog, and aside from having like a really fun plot, it just took me by surprise because it started building tension immediately, and that is not something that I have been able to let go of. I loved this book so much. Next up we have The Feeling of Falling in Love, and this is honestly one of my favorite book covers for the entire year. The fact that this is like a love story and the cover has like a dumpster fire on it, I just think is fantastic. And this one is going to go into She Was Okay. I liked it, I didn't love it, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I feel like it's, again, another one that I read but I never think about. Next up we have X's and O's, and I'm also going to put it in the She Was Okay. I definitely did like X's and O's a little bit better than, actually scratch that, we're going to put X's and O's into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend, because I definitely did, and I would. If you want more details on any of those 3 books that I just talked about, again, I did do a Valentine's Day reading vlog, and I talked a lot more in depth about those ones. Next up we have The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and this one is definitely going into Can't Stop Thinking About It. This book actually took me a little bit of time to kind of get into, but I've mentioned this every time I've talked about this book, but Henry is someone that I really resonate with. I have never in my life felt so seen by a book character. It gives me all the feels, and this book also gave me the feels. I ended up crying a couple of different times. Like, if a book makes me cry, usually that's not like a good thing. I like the fact that it makes me emotional because it makes me feel like, oh, it was good writing, but I don't like to cry when I read unless it's like happy tears, which I don't think has happened before. But life is sad enough, you know? I don't need to also have my like enjoyable hobby make me cry as well, you know? Moving on, the next book that we have is A Game of Fate, and this is essentially a Hades spin-off of A Touch of Darkness. So A Touch of Darkness is, again, a Hades and Persephone retelling, and all of those books are from the perspective of Persephone, whereas the Hades saga like spin-off series is in the perspective of Hades. Moving on, we have Daisy Jones and the Sixth, and this is also going to be going into You've Been Demoted. I did a whole reading vlog solely on this book. I kind of resisted getting it for a while because I just didn't care for the subject matter, which is basically about a band. But Amazon came out with a series of this book, and I decided it would be fun to do kind of like reading vlog where I read the book and then watched the show, which I did do. And I did enjoy the book decently enough, but I definitely did rate it higher, I think, originally. Thinking back on the story, I don't care about it. You know, it wasn't bad, but I don't care. So next up we have The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, and we are going to be putting that into Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend. This is basically a like whodunit murder mystery where everyone is kind of contained to one location, which are my absolute favorite types of murder mysteries. But this one has a really cool spin on it where the guy that's actually trying to like solve the murders wakes up every morning in the body of a different guest or like potential murderer and repeats that day over and over again for 7 days, and he has to like figure out who murdered Evelyn Hardcastle. It is so interesting. It's very chaotic, like there's a lot going on. So it was kind of hard to follow, but it was a really fun read in my opinion. So there's that. And then we have Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and this one is going straight to the top to Can't Stop Thinking About It. This is definitely a cozy fantasy to its core. It is a very slow-paced book. It is very low stakes, and it did take me quite a bit of time to actually get invested in the story, but once I did, this was just so cute to me. I have like very fond feelings for this book. Like I just remember it being like just a sweet book. Like it gave me warm fuzzies. I freaking loved it. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm pretty sure I read this book in 2022, like December, like the very, very end of 2022. So this shouldn't even be in here, but it is now. So moving on, we have The House in the Cerulean Sea, and this is another one that I cannot stop thinking about. Thinking back on the story, it was so sweet and so cute, and it just gives me warm fuzzies, and I absolutely loved it. Next one we have is Wayward, which I'm going to be putting in She Was Okay. I'm very tempted to put this one in Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend. Actually, you know what? We're gonna do that because looking back on the story, it is a really cool story and I did really enjoy reading it. It's basically about 3 generations of witches within the same family, and you do get the perspective of each of them individually, but you also get how their stories kind of like intertwine. Like if one of them from the past does this, then it kind of affects the one over here and that kind of thing. It was really, really interesting. So we're gonna go ahead and put that in Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend. Next up we have If Cats Disappeared from the World, and this one I did not talk about at all because I read it and totally forgot about it. This is basically like a little magical realism book. It's very short. I think I read it in like an hour randomly one day. We're putting this in I read it, by the way. But basically this is about a guy that gets cancer, and the devil, I think it is, like appears and tells him that he can get 1 extra day for everything that he makes disappear from the world. And eventually he's given the option of either just dying or making his cat disappear from the world. So it wasn't a bad book, but again, it was one that I literally read and never mentioned. Next up we have Memorial by Brian Washington, and this one I'm gonna put in She Was Okay. There were certain things that I really enjoyed about this book, and then other things that I didn't really care for. I feel like it was kind of slow. It's kind of got like a bittersweet kind of vibe throughout the entire thing, and again, I want my reading to be happy, and this was not a happy book. On that same vein, we're gonna jump ahead a little bit with Bad Fruit by Ella King. This was another one that I'm gonna go ahead and put in She Was Okay. This one, again, has a very like slice of life, but like in a depressing way, and it talked a lot about family traumas and things like that, and it actually made me cry because it was just so sad. Next up we have Accidentally Amy. I definitely liked Accidentally Amy. It was cute, but honestly, beyond the initial intro to the book, like of the two main characters like bumping into each other at the coffee shop, I don't really remember much else about this book. This one should honestly probably go in the You've Been Demoted, again, because I think when I first finished that book, I gave it 4 stars because I really enjoyed it. I do remember liking reading it, but I think at this point it has to be a 3 at least because I don't remember it. So maybe I should put it here. Feels weird because I don't think that Accidentally Amy should be lower than these two, but I feel like the You've Been Demoted category isn't necessarily lower than She Was Okay. It's just a different type of version of the same thing. Anyway, next up we have A Kingdom of Stars and Shadows, and this one is going into Can't Stop Thinking About It. I loved this series so freaking much. Me and my sister both read the entire trilogy over a weekend, just kind of like on a whim, and we both were absolutely obsessed with it. There's 3 books in the series currently, but I do feel like I saw a 4th one on Amazon recently, which I need to look into because, again, absolutely obsessed with this series. Then we have Nettle and Bone, and I'm gonna go with She Was Okay. A lot of people really, really love this book, and I definitely like it. There was a lot of really cute things about this book, but I feel like overall it was just maybe too slow because I remember being kind of bored while reading it a little bit, so it was just all right. Next up we have Magnolia Parks, and that one's gonna go into Thoroughly Enjoyed, Would Recommend. This one kind of like caught me by surprise because I wasn't sure if I was gonna like it or not because everyone talks about how like toxic and crazy it is. And honestly, if anything, I remember being surprised by the fact that it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. So this was actually one of the occasions where I feel like the hype actually helped because it set my expectations lower and I was pleasantly surprised. Next up we have The Cruel Prince, and that one is also going in Can't Stop Thinking About It. Again, another series that I absolutely devoured within a weekend. This was also like a tipping point for me. This is when I realized that I really loved fantasy romance versus just regular romance. I had not read a single fantasy romance until this year, unless you count like Twilight. But that was like, I was in high school, I think, when I read those, which was a quadrillion years ago. But aside from that, like I always considered myself like a romance girly. I thought I purely liked romances. But this year is really when I realized I love a little touch of magic. Magic makes it so much better. Next up we have Hooked, which is the first book in the Never After series, which are spicy, dark romances, which aside from like the Wicked Villains and the Neon Gods, which are again kind of more erotica, Hooked was the first official, I think, dark romance that I read, and I liked it. It took me a second to get used to it. I think this was the very first like violent book that I've read. Like it opens up, I think, with Hook like gutting someone or something like that, and I was very taken aback. But now I'm totally used to it and I love it. Ooh, okay, so this is gonna be a little tricky. I did not put this series together, but we're gonna do that in a second because I feel like I need to explain myself. So this one, Hooked, we're gonna go into She Was Okay. Like with the Wicked Villains series, I wasn't necessarily ready for what I got, so I was a little like, whoa. But if I was to read it again now, I feel like I would like it more than when I originally read it, if that makes sense. So I actually should probably put it a little bit higher, but we're gonna leave it there for now because we also have Scarred and Wretched, which I thoroughly enjoyed, would 1000% recommend. I've read the first 4 books in the series, and where's the 4th one? Twisted. The Twisted is the 4th one, and we're gonna also put that one with She Was Okay. The Never After series is another series where the books are inspired by Disney movies. So we have Hooked, which is obviously Peter Pan / Hook, and then Twisted is Aladdin, Scarred is Lion King, and then Wretched is The Wizard of Oz, which actually I feel like Wretched should go into the Can't Stop Thinking About It category because going into this book, I did not think I was gonna like it. I thought for sure it was gonna be my least favorite of the group because first off, The Wizard of Oz is not a movie that I really care about. And then also the back of the book, like the synopsis, was not something that I thought I was gonna like. It's basically a dark romance between a DEA agent and the daughter of like a drug Lord King person. And yeah, so basically everything about that book going into it did not sound appealing to me, and it's one of my favorites. I absolutely loved it, so I feel like that one has to go with the Can't Stop Thinking About It. On that same kind of wavelength, we have The Never King, and that entire series is also going to be going into Can't Stop Thinking About It because I am absolutely obsessed. This is more so like smut erotica kind of style spice, and it is also another retelling of Peter Pan. Next up we have Thunderhead and the Toll, which are the second and third book in the Scythe series. I read Scythe at the end of 2022, and I really enjoyed these books, and I did actually leave both of these singular instead of clumping them together because Thunderhead I thoroughly enjoyed and would recommend. The Toll, she was just okay. Obviously, if you're going to read Scythe, I would recommend reading all 3 books. I gave the series as a whole 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. I think it has such a cool concept. Thunderhead, though, was like a standout. I liked that one the best out of the entire series, and The Toll was a standout in the opposite way. It took so long for me to read that book because it was so slow. Also, too, Thunderhead had left off on a really big cliffhanger, and it took so long, like halfway through The Toll, for them to finally address what happened at the end of Thunderhead, and it just drove me insane. So my reading experience for The Toll, although I did, like looking back, enjoyed the story, the reading experience was not my favorite. Now we have A Curse So Dark and Lonely, and this is a Beauty and the Beast fantasy romance retelling, and I also thoroughly enjoyed and would recommend. Next up we have King of Battle and Blood and The Queen of Myth and Monsters, both by Scarlett St. Clair, who has become one of my favorite authors. I pretty much love everything that I have read from her so far, except for Queen of Myth and Monsters. I absolutely loved King of Battle and Blood, and I was really excited to read Queen of Myth and Monsters, but honestly, like months later, looking back, I couldn't tell you a single thing that happened in that second book. Like I don't remember it at all. Actually, you know what? We're gonna move it into You've Been Demoted because again, I probably originally rated that higher than I would probably give it now because I don't remember it. Next up we have Heartless, and I'm gonna go ahead and put that one in, She Was Okay, because this one is not a happy ending book. And I feel like that is something that I wish I had have known before reading it. I loved this book so much, and then the ending just like completely ripped my heart out and stomped all over it. Next up we have a little line of Lynn Painter books. We have Mr. Wrong Number, The Do-Over, and The Love Wager, which are all going to go into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. I love Lynn Painter, and I loved all of those to like the same degree. Like I can't say that I liked any one a little bit more than the other ones. Like I just enjoyed them all. On that same note of romance novels, we have Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, and she is also a new favorite author. I read 2 of her books this year, Yours Truly obviously, and then Part of Your World. And Part of Your World I'm going to put into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend, because I did. But Yours Truly definitely is going to go into Can't Stop Thinking About It because the main male character in that story has anxiety. I loved the way Abby Jimenez kind of portrayed anxiety and his struggles with it and things like that. And again, I have never felt so seen in a book. I didn't think it was something that I needed until I read it. Next up we have Belladonna, and this one we're going to go into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. I have seen very mixed reviews on this book, but for me personally, I really enjoyed it. Next up we have Once More with Feeling, and this one is going to go straight into I read it. This book was so disappointing. I read Funny You Should Ask in 2022, and I actually really enjoyed that one, and the covers of these books are so freaking cute, so I had to get this one, but this one really fell flat for me. There was so many times while I was reading it that I was just kind of like wanting it to be over. Next up we have The Writing Retreat, and that one is also going to go into I read it. The setup of this book I actually really enjoyed, and I thought it was going to go a certain way, and it totally just like went in the opposite direction and got real crazy, and it just was not at all what I was expecting nor wanting. Next up we have Mountain Made of Glass by Scarlett St. Clair, and this one is also going to go into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. I'm tempted to put it into Can't Stop Thinking About It because it's definitely one that stands out to me, but as far as the actual story goes, there's definitely some some missing spots. Like I don't really remember the entire story, so I definitely feel like I cannot put it at that top tier. But I do definitely highly recommend it. I read this one on my Kindle. It's a pretty short book. I think I read it in total in like 4 hours, but I'm really impressed by the amount of things that Scarlett St. Clair was able to kind of like put into the story. And then we have A Court of Thorns and Roses, the infamous ACOTAR. And this one is, I think, going to go into thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. I really, really loved it, but since finishing it, I have read Fourth Wing, and that one is definitely a can't stop thinking about it. I say this literally every single time I talk about this book, but anything that I could possibly want in a fantasy book, Fourth Wing has. And I have definitely heard some reviews where that's like a negative toward the book, but for me, that is like the positive of positives. Like, why wouldn't I want all the things that I love in a book? Basically, I do feel like I have equal love for both ACOTAR and Fourth Wing, but I do actually still think about Fourth Wing, whereas ACOTAR I don't really think about anymore, except for when it comes to A Court of Silver Flames, because I read that, I think like a month or so after I read the rest of ACOTAR, and to be honest, the only reason that one like stands out to me more than the rest of it is because it was a struggle. It took me so long, I feel like, to read that last book. And I think that was mostly because I really, really dislike Nesta. Even after reading the 700 and something page book, I still don't really like her. She got better near the very, very end, and I definitely liked a few of the things that happened in that book. I couldn't even honestly really enjoy the romance all that much because although I love Cassian, he's like one of my favorite characters, but I just really dislike Nesta. But I am leaving it in She Was Okay, and I'm also going to go ahead and put A Court of Frost and Starlight in She Was Okay as well. I did enjoy that one. It's a quick little kind of like novella. It's kind of like them preparing for and on the day of like the winter solstice and stuff, like exchanging gifts and things like that. So it was a cute little book, totally not necessary, and has absolutely nothing to do with the actual ACOTAR series. So yeah, so that's kind of how I feel about ACOTAR. Absolutely loved the first 3 books. The other 2 could have done without, but they were fine. And then as far as like Iron Flame goes, which is the sequel to Fourth Wing, I'm gonna put that one in thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. I had a lot of fun reading that one. I did a full reading vlog for that, like with spoilers and everything, and I didn't enjoy it as much as Fourth Wing, which was kind of disappointing, but I did still really, really like it. So there's that one. Next up we have Big Swiss, and this is gonna finally be our first book to go into not for me. Overall, I think I gave this book 2 stars, and there was definitely some things in it that I liked, but overall, I think this is considered like a, what's it called? Like a literary fiction, where it's again kind of like that like slice of life. It just kind of feels like a random selection of days in someone's life. That's kind of the vibe that I get from Big Swiss, and I've learned specifically after reading this book that that is not the type of book that I like to read. Next up we have A Court of the Vampire Queen, also by Katie Robert. And this one is gonna go into I read it because that was a rough one. It started off so good. So this one is another like very spicy, smutty fantasy romance between vampires, as the title suggests. And this one is a reverse harem, so it's 1 vampire queen and 3 male love interests. And this one started off so good. Like, I think it was within like the first couple of pages, the female and the first male lead met, and there was immediately a spice scene. And typically that kind of thing, if like spice happens too quickly, it doesn't really do anything for me. You know what I mean? There's no tension, no nothing. So it's just kind of like, okay, I guess this is happening now. But with this one, it was actually so effective and it surprised me. But then we had like a random pregnancy trope in the middle, and it really threw me for a loop. I am not a fan of a pregnancy trope, and it kind of overshadows the excitement that I got in the beginning of the book. Next up we have Kingdom of the Wicked, and that one is flying to the top to can't stop thinking about it because I literally cannot stop thinking about the series. I think about this series more than any other series that I've read this year. The concept of it I think is just really cool, with like the princes of hell being the 7 deadly sins, and it was spicy. I loved it. I do just have the 1 book to kind of like represent the series as a whole, like I mentioned earlier. And I will say that the Kingdom of the Wicked, like the first book in that series, is my least favorite of all of them. That one's kind of where the story is being built up, and the 2nd and 3rd book is when the story really kind of like kicks off and you get like all the good stuff. Next up we have Ninth House and Hellbent, and Ninth House I'm gonna go ahead and put in She Was Okay, because very similarly to actually the first book in the Kingdom of the Wicked series, there was a lot of story and world building that had to happen in Ninth House. But unlike the Kingdom of the Wicked, it was kind of boring. There was definitely moments in it that I really enjoyed, but Ninth House took me so long to get into. But Hellbent, on the other hand, that one is going to go in thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend, because absolutely loved that one. We did so much like world building and story building in Ninth House. Hellbent just kind of like started off with a bang, got right into the story, and it was like just action, action, action. And that is how I like my stories to go. Then we have the Mary Shelley Club, and that one I'm gonna go ahead and put also in She Was Okay. This one was very kind of like middle ground for me. I enjoyed it, but it was nothing special. Then we have the Marlowe Murder Club, another She Was Okay. This one has such a cute concept. It's basically about an old lady who ends up kind of seeing her neighbor get murdered, but she doesn't see who does it. So she ends up like running around her neighborhood trying to figure out who murdered her neighbor, and she kind of ends up gathering a couple other people from the neighborhood, like a single mom and things like that, and they end up calling themselves the Marlowe Murder Club. It's a really cute concept, like I said, but I will say the book got a little slow. Like, I feel like it didn't need to be as long as it was, I guess, or something. I don't know. Okay, How to Kill Men and Get Away with It. This one is, I think this one's gonna go in I read it. I had such high hopes for this book. It has such a fun concept. I love the cover of this book, but I absolutely hated the main character. Also too, it just got like really over the top. I know it's supposed to kind of have like an over the top, like fun, humorous kind of vibe to it, but it was just over the top in like a way that I don't like. So I just overall did not enjoy that one that much, and I definitely would not recommend it to anyone. I'm gonna brighten this up a little bit because it's getting very dark. It's only 3 o'clock, but you know, winter. Now we have Serpent and Dove, and I remember really liking it while I was reading it, or like after I read it. So I want to put it in thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend, but also it's been a couple of months and I honestly don't really remember much about the book. So it's making me feel like I should put it in She Was Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. Although I don't really remember it that much, I do remember really liking it. And I do remember some stuff. I just don't remember the overall story. But now that I'm thinking about it more, it's kind of coming back to me. I just haven't thought about the book, I guess, since I read it. Next up we have The Troop, and that one is also gonna go in thoroughly enjoy, would recommend, but I don't know that I would recommend. I definitely wouldn't recommend it to everyone. It's basically a horror book, but it's very gross. Like, the subject matter is gross, and I just feel like horror as a genre is not for everyone. But anyone looking for a horror book, I would recommend it to, if that makes sense. I bought it for a very specific video, and that is the only reason I read it. But I'm so glad that I did do that video and I did pick it up, because I really, really enjoyed it. Not even just because of the story. Like, the story was definitely bizarre, but I really, above everything else, enjoyed the author's writing, like Nick Cutter's writing. So good. Next up we have Fear Street, True Evil, and this one I'm going to also put in not for me. I did enjoy Fear Street for what it is, but it's not something that I think I'm going to continue to read, because although it is a young adult, I'm pretty sure it felt younger than young adult. Like, it feels too young for me. Next up we have My Roommate is a Vampire, and that one is going to go into She Was Okay. I read this one in October as kind of like a fun last minute, like Halloween type read, and it was definitely really fun for that. But other than that, it was just okay. And then, oh, we're finally on our last row of books. We have Lucy Foley's The Guest List, and this one I'm going to go ahead and put in thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend. This is another kind of like murder mystery. They're all trapped at a wedding. Someone gets murdered. Love that kind of thing. Next up we have a few Grady Hendrix books, which has become another favorite author. I just think his books have such fun concepts. I love the way he writes, and he just seems like a fun guy. We have My Best Friend's Exorcism, which, because of what I just said, this is probably gonna sound kind of weird, but I'm gonna put My Best Friend's Exorcism and Horror Store in She Was Okay. Because as far as like the actual story goes, I liked the stories, but they weren't my favorite. But again, I just can really appreciate his writing, and the concepts for his books are just fun and creative. That being said, we do have How to Sell a Haunted House, and that one is definitely going to go into thoroughly enjoyed and would recommend. That one was definitely my favorite that I read of his books. I really liked it, especially because it very specifically was a subject matter that I'm personally afraid of. At least it was like a childhood fear of mine, which is basically haunted dolls. So that one was just a really fun one to read. Next up we have The Night Hunt, and that one is also going to go in Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend, as well as God Killer. God Killer might actually go into Can't Stop Thinking About, because I read Night Hunt and God Killer back to back, and they have very similar premises, and I did describe them both as kind of like dark, cozy fantasies, because they're essentially about a couple of people going on adventures and collecting more people along the way, and kind of having like an overall like found family vibe at the end. And Night Hunt was definitely a little lighter, whereas God Killer was definitely even darker. Next up we have Powerless, and this is going to be also probably a little controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and put this one in She Was Okay. I enjoyed the reading process with this book. I enjoyed the story overall, but there are a lot of similarities to The Hunger Games that they were just too close for comfort for me. This book was kind of marketed as being kind of like inspired by The Hunger Games and the Red Queen. I haven't read Red Queen yet, so I can't really say the similarities to that book yet, but as far as like the similarities to Hunger Games, I feel like there's like a difference between being inspired by a story and literally taking specific details about someone else's story and tweaking it slightly. Also too, I feel like this one fell victim a little bit to hype, because people were like screaming from the rooftops about how much tension, how crazy the tension was. And honestly, there was some tension, but it wasn't any more than any other romance book that I've ever read. So I was kind of disappointed with that as well, because I was expecting this like crazy intense tension, and I got normal tension, which I wouldn't have thought anything of had not people hyped it up so much, you know? So I don't know, I just feel like overall I'm a little bit bummed out by it, I guess. Next up we have Legends and Lattes, and I need to hurry this up before my camera battery dies again. But this one is going to go into Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend, loved it. It's a cute, very classic, like cozy fantasy about a monster of sorts opening up a cafe. It was adorable. Next up we have Daughter of Smoke and Bone, and I'm going to put this one in She Was Okay. I'm tempted to put it in Thoroughly Enjoyed because I did really enjoy it. But as far as like the romance goes in it, it was very, very insta-love, and that just kills the vibe for me a little bit. And also too, this is the first book in a series, and I have not really felt the desire to continue the series. Next up we have the Shatter Me series, and I have 3 of the books to show you because again, I kind of want to talk through my reading process with this series. So the first book I would put into, I think She Was Okay. I almost put Thoroughly Enjoyed, but it was more of a She Was Okay. I thought it was middle ground. I was expecting much more because so many people love, love, love this series. But then we got Ignite Me, which I think was the second book. That one I'm putting in Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend. Blew through it, loved every second of it. Okay, I just looked it up to make sure I was saying the books in the right order, and I totally am not. So the second book was Unravel Me, and that one I did not enjoy. I feel like it was very slow. The writing style got very obnoxious to me. I feel like the author of this series overall was trying to have kind of like a poetic style of writing, which was really nice at first, but it got old really fast. Then the third book was Ignite Me, and that one, for whatever reason, loved. Absolutely loved that one, like I said. But then we got to Restore Me, the fourth book, and I was super excited about this one because, again, we had just read Ignite Me. I was excited. And this one I'm going to go ahead and put into I read it, even though technically I didn't. I read the majority of it, but I'm going to be honest, like probably the last quarter, if not a little bit more, totally skimmed. And I have not cared to pick up the series since. Next up we have Divine Rivals, and that one is gonna go into Thoroughly Enjoyed, would recommend. I almost want to put it in Can't Stop Thinking About It, but like Christmas happened and I completely forgot about the second book coming out, so clearly I can stop thinking about it. But that being said, I absolutely loved it, and it was such a surprise for me. I do think this one is like a historical fantasy romance, which anything historical is typically not something that I gravitate toward. It took me a lot of watching people's rave reviews on this book to finally pick it up, but I'm really glad that I did because it's a really good one. Next up we have Heartstoppers, and I'm gonna go ahead and sadly put this in Not For Me. I feel like I'm gonna break some people's hearts with that one. I know a lot of people really love the Heartstopper series, and I did think it was cute, but it's not for me. The rest of the books that we have, all of the books that I basically read in December, were some of my all-time favorites of the entire year. It could just be because I'm like fresh off of reading them, but honestly, first off, Flawless by Elsie Silver. This book I have thought about almost daily since I read it. Never in a million years did I think I was gonna be a cowboy romance girly, but ye freaking ha. I also did read Heartless, but I'm gonna go ahead and put that one in thoroughly enjoyed, would recommend, because I did thoroughly enjoyed it. Loved every second of it. I've been kind of like going back and forth, and I've really enjoyed doing it, so I think I'm gonna continue to do it, but I've been reading like one Chestnut Springs book and then one Brutal Birthrights series book, and then back and forth, back and forth. I've only done it twice, but I feel like it's kind of helping me like make the series last longer, because typically when I like a series, I just like binge it all in like a few days. But this is kind of forcing me to slow down, not only because I'm reading like 2 different series at once, but also because I'm only buying them like one of each at a time. So I have to like read them, go to the bookstore, read them, go to the bookstore, yada, yada, yada. And that has been so fun. So anyway, that being said, I've read the first 2 books in both of those series. For Chestnut Springs, it's Flawless and Heartless. And then for Brutal Birthrights, it's Brutal Prince and Stolen Heir. The 2 Chestnut Springs are pretty much tied, and the Brutal Birthright are pretty much tied, but I do prefer Chestnut Springs slightly more. Next up we have Lightlark, and this one is another Can't Stop Thinking About It. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was so creative and so different than anything else. Like, it had kind of like a trial aspects, which is what appealed to me, but I feel like they're doing it in a way that I haven't seen personally before. The second to last book that we have is The 12 Dates of Christmas. I read this while I was in Florida, and I'm gonna go ahead and put this one in She Was Okay. This one was pretty fun. I wanted to read at least one like festive Christmas season book this year. The romance itself is actually, funny enough, what let this book down for me. It's basically about a woman that signs up for this like 12 dates of Christmas kind of event, 12 weeks leading up to Christmas. Each week you go on a different date, and you do actually get every single date that she goes on, which I absolutely love. That literally is the majority of the book, is her going on these 12 dates. But that being said, the actual romance with like her childhood friend or whatever just was barely there. So that kind of fell flat for me. Very last book that we have is Half a Soul, and I'm gonna go ahead and put this in Can't Stop Thinking About It. To be fair, I barely finished it like a week ago. So obviously it's still very, very fresh in my brain, but I feel like this is definitely gonna be one that sticks in my brain for a while, because the writing of this one was so unique, purely for the fact that the way that the characters talked was kind of like how, you know, Victorian era movies are. And I don't think that I've ever seen that in a book before, and I really enjoyed it. It made it like really fun and just cute. Also too, I really loved the romance. It wasn't like crazy, but like literally the only thing that's a downfall to this book for me is the fact that it is a standalone. It's the first book in a series technically, but I don't think the books have anything to do with each other. So essentially, literally the only downfall for me is that I don't get more of this story. Like, I loved the characters in this book so much, I want more, and I'm so sad that I'm not gonna get it. So yeah. Anyway, that is all 108 books that I read in 2023, and my brief but not so brief thoughts on all of them. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I think that's everything that I have to say. I've been talking for so long. I hope you have/have had the most amazing of days, and I will hopefully see you in my next one. Bye.